Okay, so if you're like wading through the Australian in vitro diagnostics world,
Absolutely.
trying to, keep up with all the regulatory changes and still trying to get your product out there,
Yeah.
you need to have the right
Seed
information.
it, and you need it fast.
Fast, exactly. And efficiently, too.
Yes.
That's exactly why we're here today.
That's it. You've hit the nail on the head.
So,
We've got you covered. We've
yeah,
done the hard work for you.
yeah. For those of you who are, slogging away marketing IVDs in Australia, we have really immersed ourselves in the Therapeutic Goods Administration's proposed changes to Australian IVD medical device classifications and definitions.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest.
It is. It's dense.
We've gone through both the overview and the detailed consultation document from March 2025.
Yeah.
And our aim really is to give you all the key takeaways without you having to spend hours and hours going through it all yourself.
I mean, think of this as your efficient briefing.
Your cheat sheet.
Yeah, exactly. The mission in this deep dive is really laser focused.
Targeted.
Yeah, to extract that vital information regarding these proposed changes.
Need to knows.
Yeah, explain what they are, explore the reasons behind them, and then, most importantly, highlight the potential consequences.
Right. For you and your work.
Especially, yeah, and for your strategy in the Australian market.
Absolutely.
So,
Where do we start?
yeah, so let's start with that fundamental question.
Okay.
Why is the TGA even considering these significant changes right now?
Yeah, what's going on?
What's prompting this regulatory move that will directly impact how you operate in the Australian market?
It's a big one.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Yeah.
The primary driver that's clearly stated in the consultation documents is the Australian government's decision to more closely align our IVD regulatory framework.
Yeah, with the EU.
Yeah, with that of the European Union, specifically their IVDR regulation 2017-746.
Right. And I think it's really important for everyone listening, in the Australian IVD world to remember that this isn't just an isolated event.
Yeah, this is part of a bigger...
Exactly. If we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this proposed alignment is a really key part of the broader action plan for medical devices.
Okay.
And it's really about strengthening that whole system, the Australian regulatory system,
Makes sense.
for all medical devices, really enhancing transparency and, bringing our regulations in line with what's considered international best practice.
Yeah, it sounds like a move towards greater harmonization.
It does, doesn't it?
And the TGA also outlines some anticipated benefits for the Australian IVD industry.
Right, they do.
What positives are they hoping this alignment will bring?
Well, I think the biggest ones are greater consistency
Right.
in the evaluation processes for IVDs.
So that should make things smoother.
Hopefully, yeah,
Yeah.
which could lead to, more predictable timelines for regulatory approvals.
Okay, that's good.
Which is always good news, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they also want to expedite the introduction of new innovative IVDs into the Australian market.
That's always a good thing.
Yeah, so exciting.
And I think something that a lot of you are probably very interested in is their aim to reduce the long-term regulatory burden
Yeah.
by adopting a similar framework, to a major international standard.
Yeah, that potential reduction in burden. I mean, that's something we'd all love to see happen.
Absolutely. I think everybody would agree with that.
So we understand the why. Now let's get into the what.
Okay, let's do it.
What specific changes are they actually proposing? I mean, it's not a complete overhaul, is it?
No, it's not. They've been pretty strategic about it.
Okay, good.
And actually, to be honest, they've been quite helpful.
Yeah.
They've actually categorized the proposed changes
Okay.
based on their anticipated impact
Okay.
on IVDs that have already been approved for supply in Australia.
Gotcha.
Those that are listed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or RTG.
RTG. Okay.
And I think that categorization is really key.
Yeah, to break it down.
For you guys to understand
Yeah,
which of your products are going to be affected.
right. That makes a
So,
lot of sense. So what are those impact categories?
okay, so the first one
Yeah.
includes classification changes that they think will have an impact on currently approved IVDs.
Okay.
The second one
Yep.
covers changes where they don't think there'll be any impact.
Okay.
And the third one is about proposed changes to the definitions of certain IVD terms. Again, with no expected direct impact on currently RTG listed devices.
Good.
So I think if we're thinking about people who are, really focused on their existing products.
Right. The ones they already...
Exactly. It's that first category that we really need to dig into.
Agreed. Let's dive straight into those classification changes that could affect currently marketed IVDs.
Let's do it.
The first one is cancer tests.
Yes.
So what's the current classification and what's on the table? What are they suggesting?
So currently in Australia, IVDs that are specifically meant for cancer screening
Okay.
are classified as Class 2 devices.
Okay.
But IVDs that are used for cancer diagnosis and staging,
Yeah.
they're Class 3 under a specific rule.
Okay.
So the change they're proposing
Yeah.
is to actually bump those screening tests
Okay.
up from Class 2 to Class 3.
Okay.
And they also want to explicitly include the terms screening and staging in that main Class 3 rule.
Okay.
So that it's really clear.
To get rid of that ambiguity.
Exactly. And that's really to align with the EU IVDR.
Okay. So for those who are marketing, say, FOB tests, total PSA CA 125, or CEA tests specifically for screening, asymptomatic people.
Right.
This shift to Class 3 means they're going to have to do a reclassification application.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
The TGA has clearly stated that sponsors of these devices, whether they're trying to get initial approval or if they're already on the RETG, they'll need to apply for reclassification.
Okay.
And they'll have to do that according to the new timelines that they're going to release.
So they're going to give us a timeline.
Yeah, they will. So
Yeah.
that's something to look out for.
So that reclassification to Class 3,
Right.
I imagine that means a lot more scrutiny.
Probably, yeah. And potentially requiring, much more robust clinical evidence.
Yeah, to keep marketing it.
Exactly. So if you're a company that's marketing these tests, you might want to start looking at your data now,
Yeah. Start getting ready.
just to make sure you can meet those more demanding requirements.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Preliminary testing and monitoring devices.
Okay.
This sounds like it could have implications for a whole bunch of different IV
A
tests
whole range.
used across, different clinical pathways.
It does.
So what's the proposal here?
It's a tricky one. So currently, devices that are used for guiding selective therapy or for disease staging or even for cancer diagnosis,
Yeah.
they're generally classified as Class 3.
Okay.
But there's a really important note
Okay.
that's attached to that rule.
A footnote.
It's like a little caveat, yeah.
Okay.
And this note basically says that you can have a Class 2 classification
Okay.
if the device is intended for preliminary testing or for routine monitoring of an established disease. So what the TGA is suggesting is to completely get rid of that note.
So if they get rid of that note,
Yeah,
it sounds like that means those preliminary testing and monitoring uses are going to be bumped up to Class 3.
exactly. That's what it's looking like.
Okay.
And their reasoning
Yeah.
is that even when you're using these devices for initial investigation or ongoing monitoring, they still carry quite a big risk to people's health.
Because, well,
And a result, even if it's preliminary,
right, it can still lead.
it can often lead to critical follow-up, actions or treatment decisions.
So they're saying it makes sense that,
So the TGA's thinking is
Yeah.
that we need a consistent level of oversight,
right.
which Class 3 gives us.
And do we have a specific example of a type of IVD that might be affected by this change?
Yeah, so the consultation document specifically mentions immunohistology cell marker IVDs
Right.
that are used in cancer testing.
Yeah.
So if those are currently classified as Class 2 because they're used for preliminary characterization,
Right.
they would probably need to be reclassified to Class 3.
Sure.
And manufacturers of these products need to be ready to meet those Class 3 requirements.
Okay. That really clarifies it.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to devices that are used to manage life-threatening conditions.
Okay.
It seems like right now there's a difference depending on whether the condition is infectious or not.
Right, there is.
So,
At the moment, IVDs that are used to manage patients with life-threatening infectious diseases,
okay.
they're classified as Class 3.
Okay.
But some tests that are used for other life-threatening conditions that aren't infectious,
Yeah.
they're classed as Class 2.
Okay.
So the TGA is suggesting a more unified approach
Okay.
where all IVDs that are used for life-threatening conditions,
Right. Regardless of
whether they're infectious or not,
Yeah.
would be Class 3.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter what the cause is.
It's all.
It's the risk
Yeah.
to the patient. That's the key thing.
Okay. So that would broaden the scope then to include tests for managing diabetes.
Yes.
Or monitoring anticoagulant therapy.
Yes,
In patients who are at risk of thrombosis.
that's right. The examples they give in the consultation include HbA1c and blood glucose tests for managing diabetes,
Mm-hmm.
D-dimer assays that are used to look at thrombotic disorders, and PT tests for monitoring anticoagulant therapy.
Okay.
So it's all about, the risk to the patient is significant whether the cause is an infection or something else.
Right.
So that's why they think they should all be Class 3.
Okay. So this has the potential then to affect a lot of IVDs that are currently available.
It does.
What about newborn screening devices?
Okay.
Because the current system for them seems kind of all over the place.
It's a little bit fragmented, yeah.
Yeah.
So at the moment, Australia doesn't have a specific classification rule just for newborn screening IVDs.
Oh, yeah.
So some of these tests are class 2,
Right.
and then others, particularly if they're genetic,
Yeah.
they might fall under the existing class 3 rules for genetic testing.
Okay.
So the proposal is to align with the EU IVDR, which has a specific rule that says all newborn screening tests for conditions that, if they're not picked up and treated early, could lead to life-threatening situations.
Right.
Or severe disabilities should be class 3.
Okay, so this would likely mean then that some of the non-genetic newborn screening tests
Right.
would need to be reclassified up to class 3.
Yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. And the examples that they give, like HPLC for hemoglobinopathies and tests for things like PKU, congenital hypothyroidism, and congenital adrenal hyperplasia,
Right.
they really show you the kinds of serious conditions
Yeah.
that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are critical.
Yeah, and if they're missed, the consequences can be really severe.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the reason for the higher class 3 classification.
That makes sense. Okay, let's talk about something that's really important for making sure so many tests are accurate and reliable.
Okay.
Control materials.
Right.
So the changes here seem pretty specific.
They are quite targeted.
Yeah.
So right now, non-assay specific quality control materials, which are controls that you can use for lots of different assays,
Yeah.
they're classified as class 2.
Okay.
And this applies whether the manufacturer gives the control specific values or if the user assigns those values themselves.
Okay.
The change is going to introduce a distinction based on who assigns the values.
Okay.
So non-assay specific controls that have performance values assigned by the manufacturer,
Yeah.
they would be reclassified as either class 3 or class 4.
Okay.
And that depends on the class of the tests they're intended to control.
Right.
But importantly,
Yeah.
non-assay specific controls where the user decides the values,
Yeah.
they stay as class 2.
Okay.
Also, assay-specific controls, which are the ones designed to be used with just one particular assay,
Right.
they'll keep being classified based on the classification of the assay that they're linked to.
So if you're marketing a quality control material and it's got manufacturer assigned values, and it's meant to be used with a class 3 IVD test,
Yeah.
that means that that control material is probably going to be reclassified as a class 3 device.
That's exactly right. For example, quality controls that are used to check how well HIV assays are working, which are class 4 devices, and that have assigned values from the manufacturer,
Yeah.
they would become class 4.
Okay.
Similarly, controls for syphilis assays, which are class 3, and have assigned values, would become class 3.
Right.
But if you have a control material for a TSH assay, which is likely to stay as class 2, it would only be reclassified if it's got those manufacturer assigned values.
Okay.
If the lab that's using the control is the one that assigns the values, then it would probably stay as a class 2 device.
Gotcha. So that's a really specific change.
It is. It's very nuanced.
Yeah. Manufacturers and sponsors need to look really closely at
At all their control materials.
and where they're being used.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to IVD instruments.
Right.
Currently, it looks like all IVD instruments are class 1.
The lowest risk category.
Yeah, the lowest risk, but that's going to change.
Yes, that's right. This is a big change.
Yeah, for a lot of people in the industry.
Yeah, for sure.
So what they're proposing is to reclassify IVD instruments that have what they call an independent measuring function
Right.
and that don't rely on what they're calling critical reagents
Right.
to do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And then those instruments would be classified based on, what they're meant to do
Yeah. Their intended purpose.
and the risks that go with those measurements.
Exactly.
Can you just explain a bit more about what they mean by independent measuring function and critical reagents?
Sure, yeah. So critical reagents, we're generally talking about the really important parts of an IVD test
Okay.
that have unique properties, like the ability to recognize specific things biologically, like antibodies or enzymes.
Yeah.
And those things are absolutely essential for the test to work properly.
Right, to detect or measure whatever it is you're looking for.
Exactly. And an instrument with an independent measuring function,
Yeah.
that's one that can give you a result based on its own ability to measure something physical or chemical
Right.
without needing to use those kinds of critical biologically active reagents.
Okay.
So think of like a simple blood glucose meter
Yeah.
that uses a sensor to directly measure the glucose level in a blood sample.
Okay.
That sensor itself,
Huh.
that's the independent measuring function.
Right.
Now compare that to something like an ELISA reader,
Okay.
which relies completely on antibodies, which are those critical reagents,
Yeah.
to bind to things and create a signal.
Gotcha. So the Lisa reader can't do anything without those reagents.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes the distinction much clearer. So what types of instruments might be reclassified under this proposal?
Well, they give a few examples in the document, like cell counting analyzers, ion selective electrodes that are used to look at electrolytes, blood gas electrolyte, and glucose meters that use their own electrochemical or optical sensors, urine-specific gravity meters, mass spectrometers that are used for identifying bacteria, even breath analyzers that are designed to detect, volatile organic compounds that are associated with SARS-CoV-2 infection.
Oh, it's a big range.
It is a broad range.
Yeah.
But it's really important to point out
Yeah.
that instruments that are a core part of tests that use those critical reagents,
Yeah,
like analyzers that are used for infectious disease serology, clinical chemistry analyzers that use reagent cartridges,
Yeah.
instruments that are used in PCR or DNA sequencing.
Right.
Those are expected to stay as Class 1.
Go.
But if you're a manufacturer of a standalone instrument,
Yeah.
you need to check if your device has an independent measuring function and doesn't rely on critical reagents.
Yeah.
Because those are the ones that are most likely to be reclassified.
And beyond just the
Yeah.
reclassification, what are the long-term things that manufacturers of those newly Class 2 or higher instruments
Right.
will need to think about in terms of quality management systems
Yeah.
and post-market surveillance?
Yeah. Exactly. It's not just about the immediate change. You've got to think long-term as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point for future planning.
Absolutely.
Okay, the final thing in this category of changes is software.
Right. Software.
This is an area where there's so much happening right now.
So much innovation.
Yeah, so much innovation in IVD. So these regulatory updates are probably needed.
Yeah, definitely.
So what's the situation right now?
Okay, so at the moment, the basic rule is that IVD software,
Yeah.
that directly drives or controls the function of a medical device.
Yeah.
It's got the same classification as that device.
Okay.
So what they're proposing is to make that clearer.
Okay.
They're saying that software that doesn't exclusively drive or control a physical device,
Right.
and that has its own separate medical purpose,
Oh,
it should be classified separately
okay.
based on that purpose and any risks that come with it.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're also saying that software that drives instruments that are being reclassified,
Yeah.
that software will also be reclassified. Yep. And if you have a system that's got both software and an instrument,
Yeah.
they'll be classified at the highest level that applies to either of them.
Okay, so if a company has made some AI-powered image analysis software
Okay.
and it's being used for diagnosing cancer,
Right.
that software would be classified based on its diagnostic purpose.
Yeah.
So potentially as Class 3,
Potentially. Yeah.
right, rather than just being Class 1 because the imaging device is Class 1.
Exactly. That's a great example.
Okay.
And it's the same with software that's used for analyzing flow cytometry data and managing things like leukemia.
Yeah.
That would probably also be Class 3 because it's so important in a serious medical condition.
Okay.
And even software that does some analysis or interpretation of test results beyond just controlling an instrument.
Right.
That could even be Class 2 potentially. But if the software is only for running a Class 1 instrument,
Yeah.
like software for controlling an ELISA plate washer,
Yeah.
that would probably stay as Class 1. So manufacturers really need to think carefully about the purpose and the risks
Of all their software.
of all their software. Yeah.
Okay, so this first set of changes
Yeah.
has big implications for a lot of the IVDs that are being sold in Australia.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, the TGA also talked about classification changes that they don't think will affect devices that are already approved.
Right. They don't.
What do those involve?
So these changes are mainly about using specific terms and phrases from the EU classification rules.
Okay.
And the goal is to make the Australian regulations really clear and to make sure that they're flexible enough to cover new IVD technologies.
Okay.
For instance, they're proposing to use intended to be used instead of designed to be used when they're talking about devices that are meant to be used together
Right.
with other medical devices.
Right.
They also want to add cell administration to the rules about deciding if blood tissues and organs are suitable for transplantation or transfusion because of all the progress that's being made in cell therapies.
Yeah.
And they're also making changes to the wording in the Class D rule about transmissible agents.
Okay.
adding life-threatening disease and suspected high risk of propagation, and making it clearer about the risks to embryos and offspring in Class C rules.
So these are more about updating the language and matching international standards,
Yeah, exactly.
rather than making manufacturers immediately reclassify their existing products.
That's right. And the TGA explicitly states that in the consultation document,
Correct.
they don't think these specific changes will mean that any IVDs that are currently listed on the ARTG will need to be reclassified.
Okay.
And if you want all the details, Appendix A of the consultation breaks it all down.
Oh, perfect.
It explains all those changes and why they're making them.
Okay, great. So no immediate action needed.
Not for existing approvals, but it's still a good idea to have a look at these changes so you understand where the regulations are going.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Finally, we've got the proposed changes to the definitions of some IVD terms.
Oh.
Again, they're saying these shouldn't directly affect approved devices.
Right.
So what are some of the key terms they're looking at?
Okay, so they're suggesting adopting the EU IVDR definitions
Okay.
for terms like performance evaluation, analytical performance calibrator, and control material.
Okay.
These terms are already used in the Australian regulations,
Yeah.
but they don't have formal legal definitions.
Right.
They also want to change the Australian definition of in vitro diagnostic medical device itself
Okay.
to clearly include devices that are used to figure out if someone is predisposed to medical conditions or diseases,
Okay.
as well as devices that are used to define or monitor treatments.
Right.
And they're also looking at taking out some of the current wording that could be a bit ambiguous
Okay.
about products that aren't classified as IVDs.
Right.
The definition of point-of-care testing is also being changed to clearly state that it's not for self-testing,
Okay.
but they're not going to adopt the EU term device for near-patient testing. And finally, they're...
Yeah, the people who are actually out there marketing IVDs in Australia.
Right, the people who are doing the work.
So for sponsors of IVDs that are already listed on the ARTG, what's the immediate impact?
Okay, so the biggest thing that comes from these classification changes that we talked about
Yeah.
is that they're going to have to check the classification of all their devices against the new proposed rules.
Make sure they're still in the right class.
Exactly. And if a reclassification is needed because of these changes, then sponsors will need to submit a formal reclassification application to the TGA.
Okay, so more paperwork.
Potentially, yeah. And it's going to be really important to make sure they've got all the scientific and clinical evidence to support that new classification.
Which might be a higher classification.
Which could be higher, exactly.
Yeah. And what about the manufacturers of these devices? What are they going to have to do?
So they're going to have to reassess whether their devices still meet the new classification rules. So they'll need to go through all their technical documentation.
Right, and make sure it's all up to date.
Yeah, make sure it covers all the requirements for the new classification.
Okay.
They'll also need to make sure they've got the evidence to show that they're complying with those potentially stricter requirements.
Yeah.
That might mean updating their quality management systems, their performance evaluation reports, and even their post-market surveillance plans.
So this is a lot of work, potentially.
It's a big job.
Yeah, a lot of reclassification.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's going to take a lot of planning and a lot of doing.
It is. It's a big task.
Okay, so what about timelines? What are they saying about how long this transition will take?
Okay, so the TGA is proposing transition periods for these reclassifications that are linked to the deadlines in the EU IVDR,
Okay.
but with an extra 6 months.
Okay, that's good.
So we get a little bit of breathing room.
Yeah.
But obviously, these timelines depend on the government actually approving the changes.
Of course, yeah.
But as it stands now, the proposed transition period for Class 4 IVDs would go until June 30, 2028.
Okay.
For Class 3 IVDs, it would be until June 30, 2029.
Right.
And for Class 2 IVDs, until June 30, 2030.
Okay, so that extra 6 months after the EU deadlines
Yeah.
could be really valuable
It could be.
for Australian companies while they're making all these changes.
Yeah, it gives them a bit of time to adjust.
Now, it's really important to remember this is a consultation process.
It is.
The TGA wants to hear from everyone.
Absolutely. They want feedback.
So what specific input are they looking for from the IVD industry?
They want everyone to look at the proposed changes carefully.
Yeah.
And give their feedback through the official process.
Yeah.
And the consultation document has a bunch of questions to guide that feedback.
To make sure people are thinking about the right things.
Yeah, things like, do you agree with the proposed classification changes that are expected to affect approved products?
Yeah.
And if you don't agree, tell us why. And they also want to know if there are any other classification rules or general principles that they should be thinking about.
Okay, so they're really open to suggestions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they've got similar questions about the proposed changes to definitions.
Yes.
So this is a real chance for the industry to have a say in what these rules will actually look like.
So taking part in this consultation process,
Yeah.
it's not just about staying informed.
It's not just about knowing what's coming.
It's about actually having a voice
Exactly.
in how these regulations are put into practice.
It's about shaping the future.
Yeah, and the TGA has said how they're going to keep everyone engaged.
Right?
They're going to work with industry bodies, provide information on their website,
Yes.
update their guidance documents on IVD classification.
All the important stuff.
So if you're involved in marketing or supplying IVDs in Australia, you really need to be part of this.
Yeah, it's crucial.
Okay, well, this has been a really informative deep dive
It has.
into these proposed changes to Australian IVD classifications and definitions.
Lots to think about.
Yeah.